Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans. And I am reading about them in a pre-Socratics reader. So most people know Pythagoras largely just from the Pythagorean theorem, which we all learned in high school or middle school, whenever it is. Which is basically that if you take a right triangle, you take a right triangle, a triangle with one right angle and two not right angles, then the square of the two sides with the right angle will equal the square of the slanted side. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. That's what everybody knows about Pythagoras. And that's not necessarily wrong, although there is some disagreement about whether or not he actually came up with that. Apparently there's some evidence that that idea was known as far back as the Babylonians, but there's also some disagreement about whether Pythagoras ever really came up with much of anything in terms of mathematical principles. In a way, he's kind of like the Thomas Edison of the ancient world, in that Pythagoras put together a sort of school of philosophy, a school of thinkers in a Greek colony in southern Italy, and they came up with a bunch of stuff which all kind of got attributed to Pythagoras. In the same way that Thomas Edison basically hired really smart people, they came up with brilliant inventions, and he was like, look at this thing that I've invented. Don't pull back the curtain and see that Nikola Tesla actually came up with it, and all this stuff. So, Pythagoras is an interesting dude. We don't know that much about him. But he was the leader of this religious movement. And I call it a religious movement because it's an interesting sort of hybrid between a philosophical school and a religious doctrine. In the introduction in this book, in this particular version, the introduction to Pythagoras and Pythagoreanism, they say, the Pythagoreans believed that number was the key to understanding the cosmos. Their original insight was that the numerical ratios of the musical scale indicate that the apparent chaos of sound can be brought into rational, knowable order by the imposition of number. They reasoned that the entire universe is a harmonious arrangement, in Greek cosmos, ordered by and thus knowable through number. The Pythagoreans rejected Ionian methods and turned from inquiry into the stuff of the universe to a study of its form. And then a bit later they note, although it is possible that Aristotle's famous report that the Pythagoreans said that everything is number is Aristotle's own interpretation rather than a claim that any of the early Pythagoreans actually made, it's not, for instance, clearly present in the extant fragments of Phillip, who's one of the Pythagoreans that we have bits and pieces of surviving text for. But this idea, this is sort of at the heart of Pythagoreanism, is this idea that, unlike the Milesian school, for instance, who were very interested in what existence is made up of, what's the base substance out of which everything else is differentiated, the Pythagoreans are less interested in that question and more interested in questions about how everything works. So they start basically from the assumption that everything in existence is comprehensible numerically. Everything has a mathematical order, a mathematical sequence, and if you can crack that sequence, then you can understand how everything in the universe exists. And again, like the Milesians, this is actually a really almost startlingly modern type conception. The idea that there's a fundamental, comprehensible order to the universe even if it's almost infinitely complex, is something that I think some of the more like experimental sciences like quantum mechanics and quantum physics and things like this are leaning toward. But we've got these ideas about the importance of math and numbers for understanding existence. So like Stobaeus says, and indeed all things that are known have number, for without this nothing whatever could possibly be thought of or known. And this is, in a way, sort of the mission statement of the Pythagoreans, is this idea that through numbers, through mathematics, this is the only way of actually understanding existence and the mechanics of existence. Aristotle in the Metaphysics talks extensively about this in a number of passages. So in one passage, for instance, he says, at the same time as these, that's Lysipius and Democritus, and before them, those called Pythagoreans took hold of mathematics and were the first to advance that study, and being brought up in it, they believed that its principles are the principles of all things that are. Since numbers are naturally first among these, and in numbers they thought they observed many likenesses to things that are and that come to be, and since they saw the attributes and ratios of musical scales in numbers, and other things seemed to be made in the likeness of numbers in their entire nature, and numbers seemed to be primary in all nature, they supposed the elements of numbers to be the elements of all things that are. So the emphasis on music here may seem kind of arbitrary to us today, because at least in the West, we are much more trained to think about disciplines as separate from one another. So mathematics is one discipline, music is another, literature, my own field, is another, philosophy is another, etc., etc. And actually, we can even see this in the sort of physical layout of universities, where each department is housed in a different building, its classes are generally taught in separate spaces, etc., etc. So this approach to dividing knowledge into different spheres and disciplines and things like this is very much a modern approach, whereas in ancient Greece, these different disciplines that made up the liberal arts were much more intricately connected. So you studied music, you studied geometry, you studied rhetoric, you studied logic, and all of these things were seen as representations of the same kinds of knowledge, just taking on different forms. And so for the Pythagoreans, when they look at music and say, aha, scales exist, music can be understood numerically and mathematically, that's not just a sort of arbitrary similarity. That's something that's very, very important to the way they come to understand the world. And that's why the idea of music as mathematical is so fundamental to Pythagoreanism. But the other really interesting idea that we get from the Pythagoreans is the transmutation of souls. Shakespeare actually has a bit about this in the play Twelfth Night, where Feste, at the behest of Sir Toby Belch and Sir Andrew Aguecheek, is doing an Inquisition-style questioning of Malvolio, and Feste grills Malvolio about Pythagoras' opinion about the transmutation of souls. And it's an interesting thing, because Pythagoras gives us almost an idea of reincarnation, which really doesn't show up that much elsewhere in Western philosophy. But according to Porphyry, first he declares that the soul is immortal, then that it changes into other kinds of animals, In addition, that things that happen recur at certain intervals and nothing is absolutely new, and that all things that come to be alive must be thought akin. Pythagoras seems to have been the first to introduce these opinions into Greece. So this idea of like, when you die, your soul goes into another living being, or is reborn as another living being, or something like this. Like, it's very akin to reincarnation in Hindu and Buddhist theology, but it's really quite radical for almost all branches of Western thought. I mean, the Greeks didn't generally believe this. They believed that the soul went to the underworld. And so, like, you could go to the... Like, there's a number of myths and things where people go to the underworld and encounter the souls of other people. But Pythagoras didn't believe that, apparently. He believed in a sort of cyclical continuity of the soul. And Diogenes Laertius gives us this really interesting anecdote, where it says, once Pythagoras passed by as a puppy was being beaten, the story goes, and in pity said these words, "Stop, don't beat him, since it is the soul of a man, a friend of mine, which I recognized when I heard it crying." Now that's a really interesting anecdote, because on the one hand, it does say, he said that Pythagoras says this in pity. So it's possible that this is not actually a view Pythagoras held, that this is his way of saying, hey, stop beating that puppy, schmuck, which is an ethically good position, in my opinion. But it's also possible that this is a genuine Pythagorean belief, and that he actually believed that the souls of people and animals and whatnot that died were reborn into new bodies. It's an interesting idea, and I think it's one of the things that undergirds the Pythagoreans' emphasis on vegetarianism, which is one of the things that their sort of religious/philosophical school was devoted to. It's an idea that I think really sort of forces us to reconsider our ethical treatment of other living beings. Again, this goes back to the joke in Twelfth Night. If the soul of your grandfather or something like that is now in a wildfowl, what are the ethical implications of eating that bird?